Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Gianpaolo Baiocchi. I'm the director of the Urban Democracy Lab and a professor here at NYU. And I'm happy to host this evening's event by the Institute for Public Knowledge, IPK, for us to celebrate and discuss this wonderful book of a friend of the house's, Hillary Angelo. We're going to discuss this very nice book, How Green Became Good, Urbanized Nature in the Making of Cities and Citizens, with Hillary. And after Hillary, who's an associate professor nowadays at University of Santa Cruz, talks about the book, we're going to have comments from Liza Weinstein and Keil. Liza is an associate professor of sociology and chair of the Soc and Anthro program at Northeastern University. She's a well-known, I suppose, friend of the house is also. I feel like we have you out here often enough that you're practically friend and family. She has her book, her 2014 book, The Durable Slum, The Ravi and the Right to Stay Put in Globalizing Mumbai, is from University of Minnesota Press. And after her, Roger, who's a professor, I suppose also Roger, we have you out here often enough that maybe you two, maybe this is an all friends and family event. Roger is a professor at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York in Toronto, Canada. He is the author of Suburban Planet and co-editor with Fulong Wu of the forthcoming After Suburbia in 2021. So without further ado, I also wanted to raise a glass to Hillary. This is, you can imagine whatever drink you imagine in your mind's eye for this to be. But we're so happy. One of the distinct pleasures of academic life is to see a project unfold and grow and see a person's thinking become clearer and more ambitious and more important. And it's just been terrific having been your friend all these years, Hillary, to see this unfold. And I can't tell you how happy I am to be with you tonight celebrating your book. So Hillary, why don't we hear from you about what we're talking about tonight?
Sure. Thanks, Gianpaolo. And yeah, it's really nice to be here with you all today. Thanks, IPK. I was reflecting on the fact that I've been attending book events here virtually and in person for almost 15 years now. So it's nice to get to do my own. And Roger and Liza, really nice to be talking with you about it. So I just wanted to start by putting a few things on the table that I thought could maybe inform the discussion today and would be helpful for people in the audience who probably haven't had a chance to read the book yet, any of which we can talk further about. So most simply, this is a book that is attempting to give a kind of critical and historical take on the contemporary green city, which is quite often seen as both apolitical and quintessentially contemporary. So the book aims to sort of denaturalize the assumption that green is good for cities and to kind of denaturalize greening as a knee-jerk response to all kinds of social problems in the first place. And then subsequently to show how this idea gets deployed by people making decisions about the built environment, about how to restructure and remake cities. So concretely, it looks at greening projects across three historical moments: industrialization, deindustrialization, and kind of post-war restructuring, and neoliberalization, as we might call it, in the 90s and early 2000s in the Ruhr region of Germany, which is a historically industrial region of polycentric working class kind of place that we can talk more about. But in each case, I'm looking at how greening projects were used to make this kind of working class region into a legibly middle class city. And so we can talk more about why I selected the Ruhr, but what I wanted to say at the beginning is that for the most part, greening has been treated by urban and environmental historians as a reaction to urban problems such as slums and density. And so one of the motivating questions for me as I began this research was to ask how it is that these practices have been able to travel. So why cities with such very different social and cultural histories and also very different, physical environments and environmental conditions are greening in such similar ways. And so I picked the Ruhr because it's a location where green space has been really central to several successive moments of urban restructuring, even in the absence of those kinds of conditions. So in terms of the main arguments, I think as the composition of this panel reflects, the book engages with several audiences. And so I just want to kind of flag three of them. So first, urban theory. Urban sociologists have traditionally studied urban form, or cities as places. And so my work is part of a shift in the field from kind of city form to urban process as an object of analysis for urban sociologists and urban thinkers. And my own interests are specifically about how urban processes transform ideas, categories of understanding, and sort of through that produce new repertoires of social action, like greening, which is an area that hasn't really been fully developed in these theories. So two, sociology. I'm a sociologist. I answer these questions by mobilizing approaches from historical sociology, cultural sociology, and critical social science. In the book, I define greening as a social practice that is produced by a social imaginary, which I call urbanized nature, and kind of try to explain the logics and the recurrence of this set of ideas. And the argument that I make is that this ability to see everyday forms of nature, so to the green stuff in cities, as signifiers of the good, is in a large part an outcome of urbanization processes. So I look at sort of the shift from agricultural to industrial labor, new relationships to nature as a kind of leisure space. I look a little bit at networks of urban elites and how these practices were sort of traveling around through some of that. And then once available, I argue this becomes a variable in urban change as this kind of grammar of moral action is used to organize urban life. Or in other words, people then choose to, quote, improve cities by greening them. The third kind of area that I think a lot about is urban policy and practice. So as some of you may know, or you may not know, I used to work for the New York City Parks Department. So I have a background as a parks professional, and that was sort of part of what brought me to some of these questions. And I've already mentioned how the book is in part trying to kind of denaturalize this knee-jerk turn to green as a solution to urban problems. But more, I also look at how the idea of nature as standing outside the social allows greening projects to be carried out and received as investments in the public good. And so, of course, we know that greening and nature and urban nature can be extremely unequal in terms of access, right? When we think about the distribution of parks or tree canopy cover. But I also try to show how when we green, we are not actually providing transparently beneficial and universally accessible public goods, but we're building really specific ideas of good cities and citizens into the landscape in terms of the kind of conventions for use and engagement that are being laid out. And that the power of these green as good sentiments actually affects planning and reception in really specific ways, such as by shortening planning processes or foreclosing critique of these projects. And so then the last thing I just wanted to say before I stop talking is something briefly about climate change. So the empirical portions of the book end in the early 2000s. So it's really looking at the greening of post-industrial areas and the kind of industrial parks and cultural consumption surrounding those. And so, you know, we're now in a really different moment of green urbanism that's oriented towards sustainable cities, climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. This is really it's the frame of the book. I talk about it in the introduction and conclusion, but it's not what the research is based on. But what I've argued, what I've found in work I've published since and have argued since is that in a large part, I think contemporary climate action is visibly driven by this same aesthetic and moral repertoire. So even in this new moment of urban crisis with a new set of protagonists and a new set of urban ideals, we still tend to see a bias towards kind of aesthetically green solutions, even in spite of the kind of questionable ecological benefits and sometimes regressive impacts of these kinds of projects. So I'll stop there, but I'm really looking forward to everyone's comments and questions.
Thank you, Hillary. That was great. Liza, shall I pass the word off the proverbial microphone to you?
Sounds great. Thanks, Gianpaolo. And thanks everyone at the IPK for organizing the book event and for inviting me to participate today. And thank you especially to Hillary for writing such a rich and engaging book that gives us great fodder for our conversation. So in terms of my contributions, I'm going to briefly begin with a few words about some of what I found most useful, most interesting, and engaging about the book. And I'm going to be speaking kind of primarily from a disciplinary perspective as Hillary was talking about the various audiences for which she wrote the book, I sort of feel like I'm in part speaking as a sociologist and thinking, and we'll think together about the book's contributions to a global urban sociology, or a globalizing urban sociology, but then also thinking from the perspective of historical sociology. And this is going to kind of lead into my main line of questions and provocations, and how we might think about the methodological concerns in the book and its contributions to potentially an emerging historical sociology of cities. So as we've just heard from Hillary, How Green Became Good offers an explanation for the popularity of urban greening efforts in cities around the world through a detailed historical case study of urban greening in the Ruhr Valley. So by situating her research not in an iconic city or a high-profile project like New York Central Park, but rather in a series of greening efforts undertaken in the Ruhr Valley's polycentric industrial regions over a 150-year period, Hillary is able to separate the urban greening processes from the specific cities, projects, and historical moments with which they're usually sort of more typically associated. So while more conventional approaches view greening as a response to the urban form or to specific urban problems, as she said in her introductory comments, like slums, or also to the perceived loss of community or Gemeinschaft, Hillary's analysis helps reveal that urban greening is, as she says in the book, bound up in social processes playing out across broader spatial and temporal scales. So in doing so, she demonstrates that greening is not a response to the loss of green space, for example, which really wouldn't apply very aptly in the still quite green Ruhr Valley, or merely to elite civilizing projects or neoliberal greenwashing efforts that are too closely tied to specific historical moments. But rather, when viewed across the broader spatial and temporal scales, we see that urbanized nature is inextricably tied up in the process of urbanization and the creation of a legible urban form. So Hillary argues that urban nature, acting as a social imaginary, has remained a key component of urbanization processes and its attendant binaries and dualisms of home and work, private and public, and nature and society, most directly. So across the three historical periods on which she focuses, the book outlines the processes through which urbanized nature is constructed and reconstructed as a moral, universal, and aspirational good, and operates as a guide to moral action. So contributing to a global urban sociology, the book builds theory, not from Chicago, Los Angeles, or London, but rather from the unlikely location of the Ruhr Valley, outside of an iconic city with its symbolic and physical boundaries. This enables Hillary and her analysis to push against the tendencies of methodological cityism and what Neil Brenner has called the city's nominal essence. But rather, she's able to focus on processes of urbanization as she traces and explains the changing forms, as she says, of investment, production, consumption, and the social relationships of industrial urbanism, which constitute this moral view of nature just as they constituted cities. So while this decentered approach to building urban theory is fortunately, quite fortunately, not so novel within interdisciplinary approaches to urban studies, it remains surprisingly so to urban sociology. So while the book clearly contributes to more interdisciplinary debates, I found the book really important for its solid grounding in sociological theory and methods, including its deep engagement with established bodies of thought, of sociological thought specifically. And so in doing so, it's situated firmly within debates in urban sociology, and I think very importantly helps push against the tendency to build theory and draw out theory from a relatively small number of cities, as sociologists unfortunately continue to do. But the questions that I'd like to pose for discussion this evening are less concerned with its contributions to a global urban sociology and more with what I saw as the book's really important and generative contributions to a historical urban sociology. So I see this book, and I read this book alongside what I think are an emerging number of book sitting at the intersection of historical and comparative sociology and urban sociology, or urban studies more broadly. And I see it in that light as sort of contributing to what might be an emergence or possibly a reemergence of a historical sociology of cities. And in thinking through what that might look like is sort of where I'd like to focus a little more on the discussion today. So the book says less about its methodological approaches and methods than I'm sure the dissertation on which it was based did, where I'm sure there's much more discussion of the methods. So I'm hoping we can add some of that to the conversation today. And so this question is partly motivated by self-interest, as I've spent more time in archives than in the ethnographic field for my current book project. And I've been thinking about the construction of knowledge about cities and urban politics that draws more from historical data than it does from either sort of more traditional quantitative or qualitative approaches within urban sociology. And in particular, I've personally been grappling with how approaches to historical sociology that have been developed alongside a more macro sociology and intertwined with concerns around state formation at the national level and also sort of nationalizing projects might be translated downward to the scale of the city. And so my question is also motivated by my teaching and advising, whereas I feel like I've been having more conversations with doctoral students, some of whom I suspect are actually in the audience this evening, about the use of historical methods in urban sociology and the differences between urban history and historical urban sociology, and where we might see some of those distinctions drawn out. So, Hillary, I'm hoping you can say a little more about your methodological approaches and the models, the choices you made and the models you drew upon in constructing the historical research for this project, and how you saw it contributing to urban theory and sociological analysis through historical data. And then also how we might be able to extend the methodological approaches that you developed in writing this book and appropriated and adapted to your own needs, and how we might think about extending these to other urban contexts and other understandings of other urban social processes. So that's where I'm going to leave it for my comments and hand it to Roger.
Thank you very much. I also want to extend my thanks to the hosts for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm very happy to be here, and I, as you may have guessed, because I have a blurb on the back of the book, I was one of the lucky people who were able to read the book before it was a book, and so I still am surrounded here by the leaves of a manuscript, but I also have the book here, and it's a bit like revisiting something that I did a while ago. So I'm quite happy to be finally able to speak to somebody about it, because I've been telling as Liza has, my students who are also, I've noticed some names are in the audience, I've been telling them, there is this book has now come out and you have to read it. And it is, but I haven't actually had the chance to talk to anybody about the book because nobody I know in this confined world in which we live has read the book, and I'm meeting nobody at the water cooler to talk about the book, even though I'm in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, and one would think that in a Faculty of Urban and Environmental Change, this should be a book that should be by the water cooler somewhere. So having said that, I just want to say a few more sort of connecting, make a few connecting observations of myself and my biography that may or may not be meaningful to Hillary in having, now to face the fact that the book is out and it reaches a large audience, but it reached particularly me as a person with my own biography, and I want to talk a bit about that, and I think it's meaningful in that context. I have to get it out of the way, because one of the things is that if I get to read a book about the Ruhr area, I'm very happy. Most of you know, if you don't now, you know my accent, and when I speak, I am originally from Germany, but I'm not from the Ruhr area. But I have since 1966 been a fan of the best football team in Germany, which is Borussia Dortmund. And so my heart beats in black and yellow and beats in the center of the Ruhr area. So to read about the Ruhr area in that context has always been sort of, for me, a particular coming home. And I have, as my colleagues in Dortmund and Bochum and other places know, taken every opportunity to come and speak and to come and visit. It's an area I know very well. And I also know it well because when I was a planner for the city of Frankfurt, just as Hillary was for the Parks Department, I worked for the Frankfurt Greenbelt project as an urban planner. In the early 1990s, the Ruhr IBA was our main frame of reference, and all the main protagonists of the modern, the newest story that is told in the book about the greening of the Ruhr. That's not the social democratic 1960s story and the ones before. That's the more current 1980s, 1990s version that produced the kind of rural landscape that we can now visit, and that is illustrated in some of the chapters here in the book. Those were points of reference and are still points of reference for a larger German debate, and we'll talk about that in a second. The third point of reference for me is, of course, Hillary's and my inverted biography as a German who goes to LA and writes a book, a PhD dissertation about Los Angeles, a generation before you, and having to understand not only the historical geography and the political economy of LA from the point of view of having grown up on another continent, but also as you have and have done so much better than anyone, is to work through the Geistesgeschichte, through the history of thoughts of that place that you came to study. And that is so incredibly impressive. And I was so happy to read this because I didn't actually know much of this history, because I knew the landscape and I knew the cities and I knew the football. I didn't know the history of thought in that place. And you brought that to me the way I thought I always had to think through Los Angeles to understand America and to understand what was going on in Europe when I returned to Frankfurt to become an urban planner before I moved then to Toronto, where I have been for most of my life. So this connectivity was also connected me to another book that I just read. It's going to be published soon. It's a book that was published originally in 1935 by a German geographer, Anton Wagner, who wrote his dissertation also in Los Angeles. That book was only available in German, but became the blueprint for a transatlantic understanding of, it was the first book written about Los Angeles of any significance, a scholarly book, which is referenced then by all subsequent great authors on LA, a transatlantic shift of knowledges. And it is in that kind of dialogue, multilogue actually, that has, of course, many protagonists and antagonists, that I think Hillary plays an incredible role to create a new milestone in that transatlantic dialogue, which I think is very important. Lastly, I do remember, and Gianpaolo was part of that, and Hillary is part of that. Our latest intermezzo was, of course, a snowy weekend in New York City, where we all had to huddle in the bar of a hotel restaurant with nothing to eat and drink because the city was covered under a meter of snow. And we hashed out some of those ideas that we are now also still talking about. So this is the connectivity. And I think, even though it was subjectively biographic, I hope that some of you saw some of those connections. It also, in contrast to Liza's points about the disciplinary histories, I want to point out that I think this book, despite the fact that I see its value as a purely sociological contribution, it is a phenomenal accomplishment in bringing together transdisciplinary conversations. And having lived my academic life in the context of environmental studies, I cannot overemphasize how important I find this as a book that actually breaches the disciplinary walls and makes things so interesting to so many others who are coming from other fields like myself. So, a couple of questions. The first, I'm a political scientist, so my interest today will be on politics. And I also, as some of you know, have done a lot of work on urban political ecology, which is, of course, where Hillary and I have overlapped mostly over the last few years, working together intellectually directly along some of the same lines. And having, you know, passed each other the balls to score in a variety of conversations that have been going on. But I want to focus on the P in the U and P and E and on the politics. So the one thing is this interesting thing, the point you make about democracy and this going back to Habermas and the understanding of the public sphere, in which you say somewhere that for the public sphere, it is not always synonymous with public space and does not need to be urban. And I find that interesting, you know, that I hadn't thought of that in that context, because Habermas, of course, originally in the way it is posed as public sphere comes from the salons of London and, you know, those urban places. And that's how we also tell our students how to imagine the early modern city. And nature is somewhere outside of that city, and it is particularly non-natural to be in that sort of urban place. But how does that relate? So that's something perhaps we can talk a little bit more about. The second thing goes back to that ping pong between Europe and North America, but also specifically the two cities where I've spent most of my life is not Los Angeles, but it is Frankfurt and Toronto. And Frankfurt and Toronto share the concentricness of Chicago. You know, they're both, Frankfurt's on a river and it's sort of concentric. And as I said, I worked on the Greenbelt, which is concentric. And then in Toronto, it's the same thing. It's on a lake like Chicago. It looks the same way as those famous Chicago maps are. And I'm curious about that other landscape that you described for the Ruhr, which is so much more like Los Angeles. I'm not saying it is like Los Angeles, but it is more like Los Angeles than it is like Frankfurt and Toronto and Chicago. So the question is, what kind of politics do we find in the non-concentric city? And what can we learn from urbanized nature for that politics? So the third question, I'll make it brief, is again, that the Ruhr is a case of the urban greening in the absence of a city, you say. And then this, you wrap that into what you said in your introduction about moving from place to process, from city to urbanization, and Neil Brenner and all that. And I'm totally in agreement with this, of course. But to what degree, then, if we have thought in the past that urban political ecology and the politics in urban political ecology was based on the experience of particular places, how, and that goes back, of course, to your critique with David Waxmuth, is the question, how can we imagine a politics in process rather than a politics in place? Fourth point, all still related, is the politically in UPE, and here the question is to say towards the end of the book, as sort of recommendation, is that we need to green less. So in most of urban political ecology, the critical and the not so critical urban political ecology, we want more green. So now you say we need to green less. The question is, and you ended on the notion of climate change, question for me would be, can we afford in an age of climate change to green less? And lastly, the greening of cities intersected historically with health reforms. This is the same thing, and Matthew Gandhi's work is, of course, predominant in making that connection. What do we learn from the COVID crisis in terms of the greening of cities and the urbanization of nature? this is one of those breaks that we had at the beginning of the last century, where people thought we needed more air in cities, but also more green in cities. And that was considered to be somewhat the same thing. So COVID lessons out of the greening of cities. Thank you very much for writing such a wonderful book. And I cannot wait until I have those conversations with my students.
Thank you, Roger. I was just remembering that snowy that snowy event in New York City, and I remember, Roger, that you were very kind and generous with the fact that you did not have food or drink, but it seems like you noticed it nonetheless. But anyways, we appreciate your pleasantness at the time. So Hillary, we have a number of questions on the table. And I think the way, and I wanted to invite the audience also to submit questions using the Q&A function, and we'll try to integrate them into the conversation. One of the very nice things that IPK has done in terms of the events is we keep them short and punchy. We were discussing before the talk how burned out many of us are of Zoom. So we're going to try to keep this lively. So if you have questions from the audience, please put them in the Q&A. So Hillary, rather than just turn all the questions to you, I thought we could kind of go in parts. And I think Liza and Roger both talk to the method question and to the uniqueness of this book that's talking to different audiences and has a pretty unique genesis and unusual reference points. One of the uniquenesses and nice features of the book is that it's eclectic in that way. I wonder if you might say something about how you got there and what is your intention and who among your publics are you trying to talk to and how are you trying to talk to them?
Sure. And sorry, do you mean methodologically, the publics? Whatever.
Existentially, any way that you like.
Okay. Okay, and let me just, so yes, also thank you for the wonderful comments and everybody for being here in the midst of Zoom fatigue. Since there are a lot of students here, or some students, I just want to say, if anybody wants me to send them a copy of the book or a PDF of the book, just let me know. And, you know, Roger and Liza, of course, I'd happy to come talk to your students further at any time, or any other students from any other program. So in Zoom world, book publishing is lonely, and I would love to talk to more people about it. So, okay, Gianpaolo, let me talk a little bit about the sort of methods and origins, and then I'll get on to publics. So it is an eclectic book. I'm going to try to respond to Liza's methodological question first, which is just to say, like, I think some of this is a product of experimentation. I did have a historical sociologist on my committee, but as I was sort of hinting at, I mean, I was really preoccupied with questions of how can we think about urbanization, a large scale global process, if not driven, at least, you know, in many ways shaped by political economy and those sorts of things. How can we understand it as a process that's also affecting everyday life? I was very influenced by people like Henri Lefebvre and Raymond Williams. I have an unfinished paper that is my next thing on my agenda, is finishing a paper about the two of them and thinking about everyday life in mediation. So sort of trying to more explicitly thematize, or at least theorize, the stuff that's kind of stated in the book, but not really explained, about how I think some of this interaction happens. And so methodologically, you know, two things. One, I think historical sociology is useful for understanding processes that unfold slowly for over a long period of time, and often large scale ones. And they're also useful for doing kind of the work of sociology as opposed to the work of history, which means, like, you know, identifying similarities across change or looking at big changes over time. And so that was the goal with this longitudinal comparison, is to identify commonalities across these sort of changing protagonists, political economy, moments of political economy, and city forms. And that's a very trademark sociological move, as opposed to an urban historian that might focus on one period. I'm saying this for the benefit of the people in the audience mostly. I know you know that. And so, I mean, in terms of how one actually does this empirically, I mean, I think that was a real question I was trying to answer, both in the sense that I was interested in kind of everyday life or people's, imaginations of nature and how those got mobilized, and to do so across these different moments. So I draw on different data sources, much of the sort of present, but so some interviews and that kind of thing. But a lot of what I ended up looking at is kind of, the ideas of experts. So you didn't mention that this is a top-down book, but it is, and partly that is that has to do with the limits of my language skills. Roger kindly didn't mention that I learned German to do this project, and so I at some point had thought about doing a project on allotment gardens and other kinds of things, but I didn't, I didn't really feel that I understood the context well enough to do that kind of, maybe more ethnographic research. So this is in part a practical choice, but I think one of the things that's useful about it is that it does allow you to link, as Roger was saying, the kind of history of ideas with these decisions that are being made. And obviously there are people who are doing that in the present when we think about literature on policy mobilities or that kind of thing, or some of the work that David Walksmith and I have published together on ideas about sustainability. So this is a kind of, I think, a historical version of that, using data that was available. Okay, in terms of public, so who's that for? to respond to Gianpaolo's question, hopefully it's for lots of people. Hopefully it's not for no one. I think I describe myself as trying to bring sociological methods and approaches, or approaches of critical social science to urban theory and interdisciplinary urban studies, and trying to kind of, people our urban theory a bit more. And so there's that. The other, important public is, and this is also aspirational, but I do have a more kind of practical agenda here in terms of people who are greening cities and who are making decisions about cities in the present. And so my hope, of course, was that this book could be helpful to some of them as well. But
very nice. And let me turn back to Liza for a second. So Liza, I think of you, and you've heard me say this before, as exemplar of a new generation of folks. So maybe this is your project to create this sociology, a more global sociology of cities that's comparative historical. And the urban sociology in the US has often been shamefully provincial. And I think of Liza's work, Marco Garrido's work, other work is a new exciting thing. And Liza, I was wondering, when you were talking about this emerging field and new books, how does Hillary's book fit into that? And I wonder if you might even give a couple of examples, particularly in terms of these methods questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think you're right. I am trying to think about how we're all working. A group of us are working on a common project that is both working to deparochialize urban sociology, but also working to, I think, look at the origin of the processes and the structures that we observe at play in cities today. Where did they come from? How were they generative? How have they been reshaped through critical events? And how can we historicize the urban experience, the urban processes and the urban form today? And I think of it as both methodological and theoretical, in the sense that it helps us make connections between the urban form and larger processes of historical change that connects to emergence and transformation of capitalism, state formation, and fragmentation at various political scales. And so thinking about how Hillary's work contributes to that project, I think really kind of rooting this political economy of cities and the emergence of industrialization, the transformation of it, and then the reconstruction of space in a post-industrial or neoliberalizing context, and connecting that larger sweep of time and transformations of capitalism to ideas, movements that shape place and people within places. And so I think of, as you said, Marco Garrido's work, but also the work that Ben Bradlow and Zach Levinson is doing in South Africa, that is really kind of thinking about cities as the materialization or the scale on which a larger set of political projects materialize and interact directly with people's lived experiences. And I very much, and I read this book because I'm, I think contrasting with some other members of the audience in the panel, I'm less of a political ecologist, and I think less than I should about, about nature and cities, but I really come at this, I read this book as situated within that larger milieu and see it really as a valuable contribution to that. And I feel like it's also aligning with the work that a lot of my students want to be doing right now, that feels like they're asking big questions where cities are a site through which we can observe these larger processes.
No, I think that's very nice. And, Hillary, you described your book now as a top-down analysis. And as a committee member on the dissertation which the book is based, I vigorously disagree with that characterization of the book. I think this is a book about the history of ideas, their relationship to politics and practices and these processes. But this is a perfect point. I want to turn to Roger's questions about politics, but there's a question in the Q&A that's a methodological question that's also about politics, which is about the non-human citizens of urban life, birds, animals, fish, insects, and plants. I'm thinking of non-anthropocentric sociology as political ecology. Does your critique of green spaces ignore these non-humans? And we'll turn to Roger's questions after you field this very easy one.
Okay. Yeah, that was helpful, Liza. Thank you for saying all that and naming the work of these wonderful scholars, who I think is also really great. And I just want to say that this project I see as very much in the spirit of many discussions about sort of, doing urban theory differently from elsewhere. This is obviously a site in Western Europe, but I think in its spirit, it's consistent with a lot of that work. So in terms of the non-human, yeah, so I say this pretty explicitly in the book. I mean, in some ways, this is not a work of urban political ecology in the kind of sense of Matthew Gandy and some of Roger's work, and I mean, worlds that we're familiar with, in that it is really very focused on human understandings of representations of nature, or, things that appear to us to be non-human. So let me say this differently. It is a work of political ecology, but it's focused on the kind of the level of representation or the level of sort of ideology and what that does. It's not sort of critiquing our binary understanding of these environments. It's asking what our binary understanding of these environments is doing to the way we make and remake cities. So animals appear a lot. There's a whole chapter focused on a sort of new left social movement in the 1960s that has all kinds of really quite compelling arguments about how lives lived with animals produces particular forms of solidarity and community and political life. I'll just give one concrete example. So they talk about if you have a lot of rabbits, you're more likely to be supported by your neighbors because you have to spend your free time at home. When you go away, you have to ask people to take care of them. You end up with a bunch of baby rabbits that you have to give to people, and so on, right? So animals are there, but this is a work of sort of sociology in that the actors are the humans. Okay.
Yeah, so Hillary, let's pivot to the questions about politics. So Roger
yeah.
put a number of challenges, big picture questions on the table.
Yeah, these are good questions. And I'm not sure which one to start with here. So many questions of politics, in relationship to what does politics look like? I mean, you didn't say the phrase "the right to the city," but you're sort of talking about what does politics look like outside of a dense and heterogeneous geographic area where we're all gathering in a plaza. What does it look like in terms of process? What does it look like in terms of cities with different kinds of morphologies? Yeah, those were the big kinds of pictures. And to be honest, I have never thought about these questions before, and I don't know that I have a great answer for you. I think, in terms of the Habermas point, I was just trying to remind us that it is not only the plaza and the coffee house where politics happens. And of course, we know Zuccotti Park, and I mean, we know that parks are important sites for politics in cities, but I think the way that green space reflects, crystallizes, produces particular kinds of political life in often quite large scale ways and over big periods of time isn't something that has been thought about. And I guess that's what I was trying to say with that.
Well, let me turn to Roger for a second, and maybe. So Roger, in your current work, in your forthcoming book, do these ideas of greening as this kind of powerful imaginary, are they playing this kind of role?
Well, yes, they are. But before I go there, let me say something about animals too, which Hillary didn't mention, but which is in the book. Of course, those colonies, the workers, not just the people in the 60s, they had animals. And those, when Hillary says rabbits, I believe that most people in the audience think these are the cuddly things that kids have. No, they were meant to be eaten. And they were working animals, right? So people had goats and pigs and all that. So there was nothing cuddly about that. Maybe, they're still cuddly animals, but the relationship, and that is again sort of the Frankfurt thing. While Frankfurt also, when I worked in the Greenbelt project, had I think Frankfurt may be, besides Berlin, the city with the most colony type gardens, in hundreds, thousands of them, which were part of the Greenbelt in Frankfurt, which have now migrated from being mostly a domain of the German working class to the domain to a large degree of the immigrant working class, who have these gardens, and they also have rabbits in them and chickens and all kinds of things. So it is important, again, when we think about this idea of the gray city versus the green city, that in some visions and realities of the urban landscape, and the Ruhr was a typical example of that, animals always coexisted with people. And in the hygienic city, that in the healthy city, like here in Toronto, it is anathema to have animals in the city. People have dogs, they have pets. But there's now a very tiny experiment with animals, like chickens, that people can have in their backyards. I think it's important to talk about that because as we are moving on to a new type of post-pandemic climate change induced urbanism, it is important that we look at other previous models of how we have lived with animality of all kind, whether that was cuddly animality or it was the one to be eaten. We need to come clear on these things. And I think that, again, Hillary is too modest to mention the fact that this book contributes greatly to that conversation in a very practical way with experiential collective histories of how people actually lived in urban nature with animals and other things that we think don't belong in cities. So I think I wanted to throw that in because I think it's an important conversation. Yes, I do. In answer to your question, these are some of the themes. I work, as some of you know, and Hillary is involved in that with a chapter, and we're currently in the finishing stage of publishing the book, an edited book with Maria Kijker, Tate Mantler, and Yanis Tsaninis out of Amsterdam, which is an extension of a paper we wrote on basically suburban political ecologies. Which and the book is sort of a large spectrum of different analyses that take some of the aspects that we're discussing tonight farther. It's not the same project, but it is a project that largely overlaps with trying to find answers to some of those questions of what we need to change and to what degree a realignment and a reassessment of the relationships between what was classically understood to be the city and classically understood to be its nature, how we are going to resolve that. because it isn't just done with the greening in that, reformist way. And Hillary's book is so good at pointing that out, because when you do the kind of work that I've been doing practically with the green belt, and also with my work here in Toronto, there's also a green belt, and I've been sympathizing with this. One falls into this naive, in contrast to Liza, who pointed out that she doesn't feel like she's part of UPE. I have been too much in UPE. I have not been critical enough of the green in the ecological in urban political ecology. And so to ask the kinds of questions in this long-term project, in this large urban area of the Ruhr, in such a magnificent breadth of and keenness and daring approach of thought, is really helping us at this critical moment to not fall into this naive belief that we can just take green and nature and environment and all those good things and the rabbits, all that for granted. We need to problematize all these things, including the rabbits.
Thanks, Roger. I'm just going to jump back in and try to say a few more things about politics. But I also have to say, since we're trying to keep it lively, I will also say that when I worked for the New York City Parks Department, I was part of a chicken working group that was, the goal of it was trying to figure out how to legalize chicken keeping in New York, whether or not it was legal, and how to legalize it. And the very first paper I ever wrote in graduate school, which unfortunately was never published, was about the politics of killing chickens, and the gardeners who wanted to eat them and the gardeners who didn't. So yeah, and Roger, thanks for flagging that. That is very central to part one of the book. But in terms of politics, I mean, I think that's right. I was in some more like abstract register trying to imagine a right to the city, like sort of delocated. But I think the kinds of things that I would steer your attention to, one's political attention to, coming out of this project are about, there's some spatial things to be said, like greening is not just parks, but it's also things like green belts, things like corridors, things that are, movement through a city that are producing these regional geographies, one, but also that the power that these the very deep power that these understandings have in the way they shape public politics of all kinds. So some of my colleagues here in Santa Cruz have been doing really interesting work on housing and affordable housing, and how kind of environmental arguments get waged against affordable housing. So right, we must preserve our green open space, therefore we can't build more housing. Of course, ironically, then people end up having to move up in the mountains where they're at great risk for fire. So there's just all kinds of interesting stuff there. But I think these kinds of dynamics that I'm trying to show in the Ruhr, we can see in environmental politics more generally. And we see it in how NGOs and policy organizations and think tanks are developing best practices oriented towards particular kinds of interventions. We can see it how in the ways that public politics plays out in particular sites. So what things get argued for and what benefits are, they argued for on the basis of, and what kinds of things tend not to come up at all. So so I think one thing it suggests in terms of politics is at least trying to step outside of some of those kinds of assumptions as political actors as well, and to raise some of those kinds of questions, or at least interrogate some of our own common senses about what solutions are good for who.
Yeah, I think those are the kinds of contributions your book makes, and why I so appreciate it. We're running close to time, and we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. So we're actually Daniel Broyd is pointing out that NYU students can get the PDF for free via NYU libraries. I think, unfortunately, we're gonna leave Nancy's question and Anne's question to be answered later, since we are talking so much about how this book. I wanted to ask you Daniel's question, which is, apropos of Roger students and Liza students and other people coming through, they want to do openly interdisciplinary research like this. Daniel's trying to look at city government's role in energy transition. He wants to look at it through several lenses. Do you have practical advice on how you pursued and grounded your research?
Let me think about this. I think the challenge is, it is a new feeling for me to be asked this question as a best practice or a recommendation, and not simply you have very abstract theoretical interests and a very, an empirical site that very few people in the US have heard of, and how do you expect this theory sandwich to work? So I think, as Liza was suggesting, I think this kind of research is really important, and I'm happy that more people are doing it. I think that doing empirically grounded work that is asking big questions of urban theory or big theoretical questions of any kind is actually a challenging and important thing to do. And my own course in this race is to think about, as I was saying, the kind of links between, like, how do we make large scale structures and transformations concrete in the lives of people, right? What does that look like empirically, and how do we go about it? And so it probably involves some creativity. I mean, so I guess my only advice is don't abandon the project, but also think about what the context you're looking at supplies. So something that I learned about Germany in the course of doing this research, Roger, you may have thoughts on this, is that the kind of discussions between social science, scholarly work, and practice and policy is actually pretty close together, unlike in the United States, right, where sort of academics have a really hard time talking to policymakers, as I'm currently finding. But so that was extremely useful for me, because I was able to take Habermas's Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere and some other really, really big and important books, that are important to people working in other fields. And you can actually see how planners and practitioners are taking them up, are mobilizing these ideas, are putting them into practice materially at the scale of the city. And so that was a lucky find. It probably is, something you could look for elsewhere, but I think, keeping your eyes open for those sorts of things and being, so a little empirical creativity is probably required. And get yourself an interdisciplinary committee that will support work of this kind and support you.
Very nice. Roger or Liza, do you have any final words?
I just think that the book is really exciting for the ways that it takes an unlikely case and does unlikely things with it, and I hope to see more sort of creativity like that, and I think that continuing on the spirit of sort of advice for students who are participating in the webinar, one of whom I saw is mine in the participant list, that I think that as Hillary said, stick with the unlikely project, because we're sort of, I think new things can be said with places we've looked at a million times, but I think new things can be said with places that we haven't been looking at, and I think that openness really seems to kind of drive. I think this moment of urban studies is that seeking and that broader perspective.
Roger, you have the very last word.
But just quickly, I just want to totally agree with Hillary on the point that she made about the praxis orientation of some of the work that people have been doing in Germany, particularly in the urban and planning professions. I think that's really an important thing right now, for the same reasons that I mentioned earlier, that we need to now be more political in that sense of changing things in the real world. I think that's really important in that context. But it's also, I want to circle back to what Liza said about the big ideas at the beginning of what she said, her comments. I think it's really important those big ideas be brought into these more practical realms. But we need to have a better measure of what are the important big ideas and what is just fluff. Because we have spent a lot of times in particular urban studies over the last 20 years talking a lot about fluff, like creative cities and all that. So I'm not saying all of that discussion is fluff, but you know what I mean. We need to now, we don't have a lot of time. The planet is heating. We need to really understand what are the important big ideas, and then do the Habermas thing that Hillary did and suggested we do that in a serious manner with the serious and good ideas and not with the bad ones.
Very nice. Well, with that, no more fluff, more excellent ideas, good work for everyone. And Hillary, once again, as a friend, as a teacher, as a colleague, congratulations. You really deserve to celebrate this very, very important accomplishment. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.